and they mount a social movement to launch an attack on heaven to take back power from Anastasio and his coup. In the process, Cristobal, the foreign sailor, falls in love with the continent, with Latin America, well, with the continent, then with Latin America, then specifically with Cuba. And at the end of the film, he returns to Earth with the Virgin Son at Elwa. All of this film takes place in a mix of Spanish and French, and in one particularly memorable scene, a blues sung in English by Saul Yellen, head of international relations of ICAIC. Throughout, we are accompanied by the manzanillo organ physically and also musically, which in many ways is the star of the film, encapsulating the ideas of revolution in action, not revolution in declarations. So that's the themes. Some kind of initial thoughts looking at the film and its happening. Compared to the other co-productions, the film is really quite ambiguous. For Whom Havana Dances focuses on the failure of a former guerrilla turned saboteur to flee from Cuba. Preludio 11 shows the failure of a counter-revolutionary attack that gambles on the popular support of the population. Soy Cuba shows the resistance of those most negatively affected by Batista. But El Otro Cristobal doesn't really offer a clear message of hope or condemnation of a particular political regime, but it more generally reflects on the transitory structures of power, human relations, and maybe not taking things too seriously. It draws heavily on folkloric imagery and symbolism, and is written kind of shot throughout with references to French literature. So that's kind of the film and its context. The questions I've been asking myself then are, what can the film tell us about Cuba's burgeoning international relationships? How and why did the film come about? And how did it sit with these other three co-productions with who it coexisted, and how was it received? It's still early days, so I'm still trying to answer some of these questions, and some have indeed been easier to answer than others. The quickest one to answer was the reception. It was really, really badly received. In Cuba, the film, or in the kind of cinema criticism at the time, the film is remembered mostly as somewhat of a fever dream that it could be argued encapsulated the kind of early heated days of the revolutionary process where anything was possible. It was described as un intento frustrado by Lopez, like Luis M. Lopez, the cinema critic for Bohemia. But he said it was useful. He found that the depictions of folklore were far-fetched and pedantic, but he said it was useful in that it reminded the viewer that everyone was allowed to fail, even someone as talented as Armand Gatti, the director. Other critics accused the film of hermetic references to Latin America and far-fetched visual language, which came across more as snobby and pretentious than entertaining and distracted from the plot. Reflecting on the film back in 2009, Julio Garcia Espinosa, deputy head of ICAIC at the time of the production, called the fact of making of a super blockbuster at the time of an industry's birth more surreal than the film itself. And my favorite is the critic Juan Garcia Borrero, maybe about 5 years ago, described the film as pure audiovisual terrorism. In France, it's hard to know how the film was received. It was entered at Cannes in '63 under Cuba. It divided the jury but won the Critics' Award. But after the festival, there was such a significant agreement between ICAIC and the French co-producer that the French co-producer took all copies of the film. So the net result was the film was actually never released in the life of Armand Gatti, the director, and it was only released in 2019 on DVD. This year is the centenary of Gatti's birth, and it's beginning to perhaps attract some attention, but nothing sustained so far. I would argue that the film's conception reflects the revolution's focus on raising the cultural levels of the Cuban population, bringing people to culture, not culture to culture to people, and exposing them to all things good. Eduardo Manet was the driving force behind the happening of this film. Gatti was invited by him. Manet had recently returned to Cuba from 10 years of living in Paris, and during that time he had seen a staging of Gatti's The Cane Toad, which he was so impressed by, he advocated for Gatti to be invited to Cuba to come and make a film engaging with the idea of the revolution. This film was initially called Le Tambor d'Ogun, so the drums of Ogun, but became El Otro Cristobal. So that's the film. And if we take a step back and look at the wider context around it, it was, although in initial kind of looking at it, it seems to be kind of not totally, well, no, really not very engaged with the reality of a revolutionary process. The team behind it were incredibly committed. We know from an early interview with Manet that Gatti went from France to Havana on an exploratory visit to Cuba in 1961, and the film was made between September 62 and January 63. So during that time, or the time of filming, the crew lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the French section of crew arrived to a country that had recently been placed under economic sanctions, expelled from the Organization of American States, and had successfully repelled the invasion of Playa Girón. So that is to say, they arrived to a rapidly radicalizing country. But the crew themselves went because they were committed. They actively sought to engage with the idea of communicating the tale of the revolution in any way that they thought possible. They consciously entered into the language of the revolution with the idea of an international film brigade to help with the construction of socialism. They saw it as something in solidarity with the revolution. And their inspirations were very clearly, they stated it in a number of interviews, were with the brigades of builders in the Soviet Union and the international brigades of the Spanish Civil War. Gatti felt, in reflecting on the film many years later, he felt the invitation to make a film in Cuba was his chance to participate, albeit in a really small way, in a revolutionary process. The crew worked closely with the Cuban team, which it was most like the East German team. The other two teams tended to be a bit more separate. They worked closely with the Cuban team despite language barriers. Gatti himself was fluent in Spanish, so he had a good level of communication, and that helped. But they were very similar in the East German group in that respect. They relied on technology and resources that Ikaik already had, rather than, for example, the Soviet team, which imported all of their own equipment and then left them there. In terms of stylistics, Gatti has once in an interview, I think, acknowledged the interest that socialist realism may have had, but he saw that kind of an epic style was the only style suited to the story of a revolution, and indeed the film is very epic. And in a roundtable with other socialist film directors, he kind of very clearly stated that he saw every new way of seeing that could be brought to man would be a new way of liberating him, and that's how he understood the making of this film. Another element that has kind of is worth exploring more is the flexibility of the production. The film crew was constantly responding to the challenges of a revolutionary process and its economic realities. So they worked with constant shortages, which includes sometimes shooting a scene in the dark rather than with the correct lighting, without electricity. This still that I've got here is from the actual assault on Heaven, which relies not only on the army doing the assault, but also the clouds are like fumicide, because that was the only prop available. The script is open. There's a real heavy role played by poetry, music, dance, and theatre. But it was written in French, translated into Spanish by Gatti, and actors were given kind of considerable flexibility in how they interpreted that. You also begin to notice, because this film was being filmed this production was being made at the same time as the other three co-productions, there's an element of cross-fertilization with the other co-productions. The actor who plays Cristobal, Jean Boise, he appears in Soy Cuba as one of the foreigners at the beginning of the film. And where Cristobal ends with a shot of the palm trees of Cuba, Soy Cuba begins. So that's kind of where I'm at looking at the film itself, but it's also a part of that flexibility has also led me to look at the role of Cuba in this particularly in this kind of French-driven imaginary of revolution and of Cuba. At the time that the film was being made, Cuba, and particularly Havana, was very much a site of ferment and was visited by a number of foreign intellectuals and creatives wanting to see an island in a process of transformation at first hand. Sometimes this was from other socialist countries who were hoping to capitalize on the energy and dynamism. But there were many, many intellectuals from France, so Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. And then we have Joris Evans, Andrew Weider, Roman Carmen, who all kind of made semi-documentary films about the revolution. Chris Marca Cuba was really, really important. He was there at the same time, and that has subsequently been hailed by some figures in ICAIC as the best documentary ever made about the revolution. And also at the same time, we have Agnes Varda with Salut les Cubains, which was a real innovation and experiment in form using montage and just still images. But Gatti pops up in this film, and sometimes you can see elements of Varda's film in El Otro Cristobal. We also have the other film crews of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and the GDR, who all kind of intermingle with one another. And so we have this kind of glut of European intellectuals from the socialist and non-socialist world, but heavy socialist sympathizing world, all visiting Cuba in the early 60s, all documenting what they saw, but also informed by dominant vision or dominant visions of Cuba created prior to 59 and their understanding of how that may or may not change in a revolutionary process. And then on top of that, you have perhaps different interpretations of hierarchies of leadership of socialist movements. So I'd say at this time, there was perhaps little room for nuance, particularly in the production of films that were about Cuba by foreigners to a foreign audience. And often these co-productions were made for a foreign audience first and a Cuban audience second, or so it often has come across in the documents surrounding them. It also, looking at this, it also begins to raise difficult questions about intellectuals and theoretical hierarchies that would come to the fore, I think, in 68 and again in 71, but I think you can see them beginning to emerge this early on. So that's a lot. I'll start bringing it to close. Like, where does that leave us? Well, I think there's a lot more to do. I think from this, we can see that there was a real clear political commitment from the French team going to Cuba and the Cuban team as well, but also really interestingly, a real focus on the human in a system, not the system itself. I think it's very clearly reflective of the dynamics, both positive and negative, in the early 60s and in the early years of the revolution, and it can give us an insight into cultural politics of the day. To a certain extent, it reflects these ongoing debates about cultural styles in socialism, which we know rumbled along throughout the 60s and in different ways beyond. And I think it's particularly interesting because it offers us a glimpse into this imagined Cuba that foreigners sought out, and I think sometimes in their willingness or in their desire to document what was happening, inadvertently recreated. And the still that I have on the right is there was an interview with Armand Gatti after Cannes, and he still had a beard, and much was made of the fact that he had a beard. And you know, the idea of him becoming one or becoming close to the barbudos. And there's quite a comic scene where he says, well, actually, like, you're working in a revolution and there's shortages, I just couldn't shave my beard. But I think all of this gives us, is beginning to give an insight into a real complex system of currents in the early 60s that I'm hoping to explore more. And that is where I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Izzy. Thank you, and also perfectly timed. So
great.
We'll come back to Jackie and you in the questions at the end, but we are going to move on. I think I'm going to stop recording just because I don't want to keep interrupting people. It's not always that reliable.